Good evening, everyone. Hello. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm delighted to welcome you to this very important conversation as we continue a series of events at Sarah Lawrence under the theme of justice. I'm sure that many of you, like me, are feeling a little bit sleep deprived right now and at this moment, 3 days post-election, and hyper focused on the issues that we're going to talk about tonight. So we're particularly glad that we have this chance to come together as the Sarah Lawrence community at this critical time in our nation's history. And I also want to assure you that we have people watching, and we'll give you updates if any states are called or if any speeches are announced. So you don't need to be focused on all of your other devices. You can actually be with us fully here tonight in conversation. I am especially delighted to welcome our guest tonight, Douglas Brinkley. I am sure that Doug needs no introduction to most of you, but let me share briefly a few key biographical facts about our distinguished guest. Douglas Brinkley is the Katherine Tsanoff Brown Chair in the Humanities and Professor of History at Rice University. He is a CNN presidential historian, contributing editor at Vanity Fair. He has received 7 honorary doctorates in American Studies, and he works in so many capacities in public history and with museums, on boards, with colleges, historical societies. His early teaching career included teaching positions at the U.S. Naval Academy, Princeton, and Hofstra University. 6 of his books were named New York Times Notable Books of the Year, and 7 became New York Times bestsellers. Doug's authorial range is extraordinary. I pulled quickly from my own bookshelves. His introduction with Johnny Depp to Woody Guthrie's novel, Rosa Parks, and most recently, American Moonshot, the John Kennedy presidency. Doug, if you were here in person, I'd have you sign these, you know. But from those, his book, The Great Deluge, Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans, and the Mississippi Gulf Coast, received the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Book Award. He's the editor of President Ronald Reagan's Presidential Diaries in 2011. His 2012 book, Cronkite, won Fordham University's Ann M. Sperber Prize for Outstanding Biographies. His 2-volume annotated The Nixon Tapes from 2016 won the Arthur S. Link Warren F. Kuehl Prize. He received a Grammy Award in 2017 as co-producer of Presidential Suite, 8 Variations on Freedom, received the Grammy for Best Jazz Ensemble. The New York Historical Society selected Brinkley in 2017 as their official U.S. presidential historian. He's on the board of trustees of Brevard College and the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library. He's a member of the Century Association, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the James Madison Council of the Library of Congress. Doug lives in Austin with his wife, Ann, and his 3 children. Closer to home, Doug was the Brendan Gill Lecturer for the Bronxville Historical Conservancy 2 years ago, and we're glad that we're welcoming many members of the Historical Conservancy here tonight. And Doug and I share a personal connection through Rice University, where he teaches and where I'm an alum. I think our Sarah Lawrence community will appreciate this tidbit, Doug. You are the Katherine Tsanoff Brown Chair at Rice, and I'm sure that you hear from alums of my generation that Katherine Brown was the most extraordinary art historian who taught so many of us how to see and how to look. She was also Dean of Undergraduate Students, and I'm pretty sure the first woman in that role. So we share at Sarah Lawrence such a commitment to undergraduate teaching that knowing you're part of that legacy of a great faculty member of mine feels like a wonderful connection. And so with that, we will set off tonight in a conversation. I will ask questions of Doug for the first 45 minutes or so, and we'll open up and into the chat with our audience questions. And so Doug, maybe just to start us off in this conversation, when we set up tonight's conversation and set the date, you said to me that, oh, Friday would be a good date post-election. And of course, here we are. We've all watched the continued vote counting today. And I'm wondering now what you think about this date for our conversation and where we are on this Friday after vote casting on Tuesday.
Well, thank you for the nice introduction. I've been just swamped and consumed with following what's going on with this presidential election. And I would have assumed I was going to be speaking this Friday evening, talking about what a Biden administration would look like, or what a second Trump turn would look like, and handle questions from everybody, and then talk about issues of justice in America today. But alas, we're still on pins and needles, although it seems quite self-evident that Biden is going to be the next president of the United States. But there wasn't a blue wave. And we have looks like the Senate is staying in Republican hands, although there'll be a runoff of 2 senators in Georgia, which is going to be quite consequential. And the Democrats lost a couple seats in Congress. So it's back to a kind of divided government. But I think with Biden's presidency will really be a third Obama term. There's going to be repair work for Biden to try to cobble back together the full power and life-saving mechanisms of the Affordable Care Act, which was Biden's great domestic achievement. There'll be a re-engagement in climate change around the world with Biden. You'll see the United States enter the Paris climate accord and try to be a climate leader. But the idea of gridlock continuing in this struggle is probably likely too. I do presidential history for a living, and we don't do honeymoons long. Biden might get a press honeymoon the way that Gerald Ford did for a little while after he took over for Richard Nixon after Watergate. But it's just vicious out there due to social media and all the issues we'll be talking about, I guess, tonight, that it's going to be hard for Biden to unite the country. But his rhetoric will say that, his actions will be too. He sees his role, I think, Biden as a healer. I don't think Trump has a chance. It's not just about Pennsylvania, which any moment will be called for Biden, not just the fact that Georgia went Biden, not just the fact that Trump doesn't have a scenario to hit 270 electoral votes. It's that Trump wants to try to take this to the courts somewhat. It might drag out the official winner till early December, but come inaugural day in January, it's 99.9% going to be Joe Biden.
So a couple of things that you already raised for us there that I want to pick up, and one is, as you said, we're on this theme of justice, and there've been so many times a focus in our country on the notion of access, on voting equity, on voter suppression. And I just wonder, particularly in this election cycle, as you're watching what's playing out even this week, where you think we are right now in this right to vote, ability to vote, have your vote counted, language about legal and illegal voting. Just maybe.
Well, it's been a horrible year, 2020. We're all living in the COVID-19 nightmare and all that it's entailed. So, but tonight, I'd like to give some silver linings, make us all feel a little better on a Friday. I'm really impressed that Joe Biden, for example, has won the most votes of any person who ever ran for president in the United States. When it's over and done, he got 175, 75 million Americans voting for him. That's an astounding amount. Voter turnout was historic. We can do better, but we see young people engaged in voting. We've seen historic, in the year that John Lewis died, a personal hero of mine. John Lewis once had me write a foreword to one of his books, which is one of my great honors. And every year I'd go to Selma with John Lewis. We'd march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The fact that Georgia, Atlanta, is able to turn Georgia on this climate blue with that idea of John Lewis of vote, 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 no matter what complaint, or like Barack Obama said, don't boo, vote. We're starting to see more people getting engaged. There was a feeling like my vote doesn't matter for probably a malaise of voting for a while. I don't think that's there anymore. And on the Democratic side, particularly because of President Trump's 3 Supreme Court justice nominees, appointments of Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett, there's a fear, I think, within the progressive movement or the left that, oh my gosh, if we lose another Supreme Court justice, public policy and issues of social justice, environmental justice, women's rights justice will get booted out of the arena, and we will really be going back to kind of a pre-1964-65 world. And so there, everybody feels stakes are high, and I think that was a good thing. Also, there's been more corporate responsibility, companies encouraging people to vote. Mail-in, the US Postal Service with mail-in voting. We made some adjustments. Many states did better than others, but to how do you bring the vote out amidst a pandemic? And I think history will show we did it. However you voted, if you got out there, our democracies seem to be operable. And that part of this week's felt good, even though now we're into a storm of confusion for a couple weeks.
So talk us through a little bit of that storm of confusion. I have never heard so much about the arcane aspects of the Electoral College, not just the Electoral College, but what could happen, what options there are for states to bring different electors, what could actually happen in January, and so on. And where do you think we are right now with the Electoral College, with the history of that, with the way it was developed, and the comment you just made about the largest voter turnout in the history of our country?
You know, when I was young, and by that I mean when I was in my 20s and 30s and even 40s, I always thought that eventually the Electoral College would fade away, perhaps in my lifetime. That it seemed to make sense to me in a democracy. Every vote counts. The person that wins the most is president, meaning Hillary Clinton won by 3 million votes, should have been president, or Biden. Forget the electoral map right now, if he wins by 7 million votes or something, well, why wouldn't he be president? But this Electoral College system is here to stay for a while. In order to change that, you'd have to have a radical altercation in the makeup of the US Senate. At best right now, it's going to be 51-49 or 50-50. You'd have to get 2/3 of the Senate on board. It would have to be a constitutional amendment, and to scrap the Electoral College system. So I think we have to, I'm not saying young students at Sir Lawrence shouldn't spend their lives campaigning against that, but I have to deal with political pragmatism and reality. And what happens is there's so many issues. Look at public health, look at racism in America, look at environmental degradation and climate. We can go on and on and on. Once Biden gets in, the one thing he's not going to try to do is scrap the Electoral College or lead an effort for it, because he's going to want to do some deals with Republicans on infrastructure, public health, what he can. And the Republican Party is a beneficiary of this Electoral College system. And meaning rural America is benefiting urban centers at this point. But someday this will change, as we're seeing shifting demographic changes. So, people are moving back inland. You look at this season right now, I mean, the idea that Arizona and Georgia are blue, so I think things will change. So don't be disheartened if you think the Electoral College is bogus, that it can be changed in your lifetime. We can go to Mars someday too. It's just not happening next year or the next year or the next year or the next year. So you have to be if you're making that your reformist issue, you got to be in that for the long haul.
Talk about that a little bit in relation to changing demographics in the U.S., right? And what we're seeing with Georgia and Arizona in play in this election in ways that were perhaps not quite anticipated, what that means that we're counting in those states, and again, how you would compare that to, as a presidential historian, some other elections that may have tipped because of significant demographic movement as well as political movement.
Well, it's one of the most famous statements made by an American president, period, is when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Voting Rights Acts and would say, "There goes the South," from the Democratic Party. The Voting Rights and Civil Rights Acts turned the South, including Texas, where I'm at, very ruby red. It took some time for that to come in, but race is this central theme in America. In the South, the original sin of slavery, issues of caste and traditional racial problems in the South. Not that they don't exist everywhere, but if you look at there used to be, it was slow. Like for example, John F. Kennedy won Georgia in 1960. An Irish Catholic from Massachusetts won Georgia in 60 because the South was Democratic. But since the Civil Rights Acts and all, there have been some aberrant elections. Jimmy Carter won Georgia because he was from Georgia, and Bill Clinton won because he was from Arkansas. The only chance to flip a lot of these southern states up until what I'm seeing now with Biden and Harris is if the South feels they hear the accent. Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter, you get into an issue of North and South, and many Southerners feel that they are maligned by the coast, or that they're the losers of the Civil War, and people want their statues down and don't respect their culture and all. But then Arizona, you mentioned, that's where Cesar Chavez was born, in Yuma, Arizona, and Chavez and Dolores Huerta worked very hard on voting rights for Latino Americans. In fact, I once went with Paul Chavez, Cesar Chavez's son, to Arizona, to Phoenix, and he wanted me to write about it. He showed me the network that Latino Americans had developed by radio, talk radio, morning radio in Phoenix to compete with the drive-in hours of Rush Limbaugh's right-wing radio.
Of the kind of information that's going out, that's false information, that's far beyond misleading, that is just completely untrue. All of what's being spun in social media, how much of that is our moment and the new tools, and how much is something that perhaps you've seen as characteristic of past elections, but what does it say for our moment right now in a polarized set of an electorate that is prepared to believe quite different things to be true? How do we come out of this election with people believing that the votes have been legally cast?
Boy,
For
I think
example,
that's the core question of our time, perhaps. I've been worried for a long time about conspiracy history theories and the proliferation due to the advent of the internet. Walter Cronkite, who you mentioned, I wrote about, the great broadcaster for CBS News. He told me when he was in his 80s, his biggest fear for America was that we weren't teaching young people how to use the World Wide Web, as he called it, but social media today. We're letting people get information, and a lot of it's misinformation, falsehood, bots, downright, malice and distortions. And how do we ask a 12-year-old, a 14-year-old, a 16-year-old, an 18-year-old, or somebody who's my age? How do we learn to find what's true in this world of I think the untruthiness, as they say, of our times? And I'm deeply worried about that. People are selecting their own set of facts, and it's coming. It's really costing our country a lot. I'm all for the what we've done with platforms and Google and Facebook and Apple and Amazon and all, but things went so quickly, the Wild West of Silicon Valley and Round Rock and the like, that I don't know if we've thought about the consequences of this on American life. And there'll have to be tougher ways to block some pure malfeasance and libelous types of behavior that are occurring now in the amount of hate sites. You know, when Oklahoma City got bombed in the 1990s, and Bill Clinton famously went there and gave his speech about the Easy Chair speech, the memorial there of all the dead blown up. Back then in the 90s, our security experts were very worried about right-wing extremism and violence. And it's come to fruition. The amount of militia groups and homebrew hate groups right now on the right are just off the charts high. And that meets our gun culture in America. And it's worrisome.
And talk about how that intersects with this moment. So President Trump's address last night and the claims that were made about the legitimacy or the illegitimacy of votes that were being counted. The way in which it appears the next days, weeks are going to play out for us with an uncertainty that may make Bush Gore hanging Chads feel like it was a quick resolution. I know you're a historian, but you've watched lots and lots of presidential elections. So talk to us about this moment 3 days after voting without.
Well, in 2000, I did a book, the New York Times asked me to do a thing called 36 Days, where I was working with the Times about how long we had to wait for the famous recount in Florida with butterfly ballots and hanging Chads. And in retrospect, it was at the time, it was like another nightmare, but those 36 days, and eventually it had to go to the Supreme Court, and George W. Bush, of course, won. Al Gore had to graciously, at that point, step down. But that was isolating one state. What worries me right now are the lawsuits that I believe President Trump's going to try to instigate in recounts in any state where he's close. And nobody back in 2000 was really, they were questioning how Florida goofed up, how Broward County goofed up, you know, and this sort of thing. But now we're just, nobody wants to believe a result. And it's frightening. And we've had just as close of elections. I mean, John Kennedy beat Richard Nixon in 1960 by a hair of a hair. And Nixon graciously admitted defeat because he didn't want to put the country through a crisis. You want to see how to accept defeat. Watch how George Herbert Walker Bush graciously conceded to Bill Clinton in 1992. Donald Trump is a different type of person. He even if you're on and you're a big Trump admirer, you have to be able to admit that this is somebody with a very big ego, narcissistic personality and branding. And he's not he's interested in I fight till the last dog dies kind of mentality, and in some ways creating a huge electoral crisis right now that didn't need to be kicked off. We could have sanely done some recounts in Georgia and in Pennsylvania, but he wants to call into question the entire American democratic electoral process, which he called rigged before the election even started. And so it's a dark time in that regard. But you know, the point of history is to remind us that our own times aren't uniquely oppressive. And just like, you know, we got through the 1876 election between Tilden and Hayes, that was topsy-turvy. We got through 2000. We'll get through what's going on right now. I'm quite confident that a third of the Republicans in the Senate, maybe a half, will tell Donald Trump goodbye. During Watergate, it was Republicans who told Nixon he had to resign. Now, I'm not suggesting Republicans are going to be, you know, coming out in a brave way we haven't seen, but Mitch McConnell was a power broker, Senator of Kentucky, and McConnell got 3 Supreme Court justices through with Donald Trump. And McConnell now is in charge, is the most powerful Republican in Washington. He's running their institution, the Senate. He's known Joe Biden forever and can probably do a few deals with him. And Donald Trump may be learning the hard way that they brush you aside when you lose power. Lindsey Graham's kind of manipulated Trump some, meaning he's gone. We're going to have an inaugural in January. Joe Biden's going to be president, and Donald Trump will be in Mar-a-Lago, almost exiled from New York City, where they don't want him, and trying to rebuild himself as an ex-president. And what would Trump do in that regard? Probably create a conservative right-wing media empire. He's very angry at Fox News, Trump, because they called Arizona early for Biden, and he's livid about that. He was livid that Fox a couple weeks ago put Barack Obama's speech on live, which was a devastating takedown of Trump. So he, believe it or not, Donald Trump feels that Fox News isn't right wing or conservative enough, and he may create his own kind of media empire. And he still has the power of Twitter. And in America today, I know it's a cliche to talk about Andy Warhol and celebrity, but that really we create celebrities as a kind of demagogues. And he has so many followers, Donald Trump, that his voice will continue to be heard. And he very well, once he has to grapple with the fact that Biden is president, either run against Biden in 2024 or try to set up like Nikki Haley and his son Donald Trump Jr. as a ticket. He feels he represents about 30% of the Republican Party that will do anything for Donald Trump. So just because he's might have lost, looks like, doesn't mean he's disappearing.
So one of the things that you just mentioned as we were starting down that very interesting place you just took us about, not just 2020 but 2024, are some ways to think about that. Also in Bush v. Gore, the relationship with the Supreme Court and the fact that in this presidency, 3 Supreme Court justices have been seated. And there are lots of little bits going out right now suggesting that parts of this election could end up with the Supreme Court, right? Or the push through. Maybe talk about that, but also the relationship of the presidency and the Supreme Court and what's happening institutionally for us, or what may have happened relative, again, in your broader presidential historian frame, to talk about that relationship.
Well, the great question. First off, what all that is really going to happen is that Trump has set up an office to try to get like a hotline after the election for people reporting isolated cases of fraud. They will try to take places the court, and most of these are going to get thrown out by justices in their states. The idea that there's really this is going to get booted to the Supreme Court, plausible, but I don't count on that happening. But let's just make the leap that it did, and that's the nut of your question. I mean, what if for somehow Pennsylvania say goes to the Supreme Court? I think that's why now on this Friday night, we do have to pay attention to not just saying Biden won, but I think the guaranteer is by winning in Georgia and Pennsylvania and Arizona and Nevada, where Biden is ahead in all of those, because as an insurance policy on the Pennsylvania situation. Because in the 1990s, early 90s, Philadelphia had a problem with corruption. I think that Trump now wants to try to paint Philadelphia as this hotbed of corruption. Well, the problem is every vote's being accurately counted. They're being filmed on camera. They're going to be doing a recount, and you'd have to show 40, 50,000 fraudulent ballots or something. I mean, or more. It's not likely. You're going to have to show up that a massive fraud, not here's one bad ballot that somebody put in, and you'd have to kind of prove that it would made a difference in that state. And I think Georgia, as it could be, the recount would be interesting because it's so tight there. But Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania margin is breaking as we speak, more and more for Biden. So everybody in the Democratic parties is fairly happy. I mean, or if not extremely happy right now. It's going to take a while for this to sink into to Trump that he lost. Now, if it goes to the Supreme Court, I think that's Trump's Hail Mary pass. And then he believes that it's so politicized, the Supreme Court, that they'll all vote in his favor. I don't believe that. Whatever you think of Amy Coney Barrett or Kavanaugh and Gorsuch and and the rest, they are there. The thought that they're going to make their reputation in history on doing some weirdo rogue verdict to help Donald Trump belies the imagination. Even if you don't care for those Supreme Court justices, they're very smart people and they do understand our Constitution and democracy. And I'm reminded of the famous Watergate tapes of Nixon when it sounds almost apocryphal, but but it isn't. Ron Ziegler, the press secretary, went out to San Clemente, California, with Nixon versus the United States of who owns these tapes. Nixon said they're personal, and the U.S. said no, they were taped in the White House. They belong to the American people. And Ziegler, Nixon's press secretary, shouted from a cliff in Southern Cal to his boss, the court verdict is in, we got zero. And Nixon was giving like thumbs up. He was so convinced the Supreme Court was going to side with him on getting those, having those tapes be his, and he would have been able to survive his presidency. And that is Trump's last resort. Anything he does right now is trying to figure out some mechanism to boot a state like Pennsylvania into a Supreme Court verdict where he comes out ahead 5-4 or something. And that's why we are in a kind of a gripping situation right now, because that is possible, but not plausible, remotely possible.
And what do you think? Do you think out of this moment that we're at with this particular election, where the sense of how different every state, we're all suddenly, this all the time, but the rest of us are suddenly aware how differently every one of our states deals with their own electoral policies, right? And their own decisions about exactly how long they accept votes or what they require and so on and so on. Do you think we'll see anything coming out of this? Well, two parts to this question. One, we're going to, for the first time, be really waiting actually to watch the states certify their electors in a way that I suspect, at least in our lifetimes, we haven't done. And I would love your perspective on whether that's been so much longer in the past. What do you think the response to all of that is going to be? To all of this COVID mail-in voting that's happened in some states, whereas others have always had mail-in voting, early voting, when we count, how we count. Do you see anything coming out of this?
I mean, I think your first comment's important for everybody. I think everybody realized, I mean, we really are 50 different entities, a quilt patchwork together, with each state having different electoral laws. Who won, who did it well this year? Look at Ohio. They counted the mail-in votes early. So you don't have the burden of doing it after the election. But Pennsylvania got themselves trapped into this nonsensical political struggle, which was promoted by the Republicans in Pennsylvania, who didn't like the idea of mail-in ballots because they, the postal voting seems to tilt quite significantly Democratic. So their way of hindering the vote was doing a late count of mail-in votes. Well, okay, they got that done in Pennsylvania. All it's done is tear the country up right now by doing it that way. So I suspect Florida, who's had problems before but ran it really smoothly this year in Ohio, may become models for other countries how to use the mail-in ballots. And remember, President Trump tried to destroy the US Postal Service and failed. The American public has an affinity towards mail service, even in this age of the internet. And so, and with Biden in the White House, the US Postal Service is going to get a lot of love coming up. So I think more states will try to do something sane when the temperature goes down and prepare for 2022 midterms with a way where they're counting the mail-in votes early. There's no sense of waiting till the end.
And as you referenced there, a Biden presidency and, for example, the U.S. Postal Service, how a presidency that again will be divided or potentially divided, or at least so close to it, and a country where mimicking 2016, again, we have votes in so many states that were just barely one way or the other. What's the reality for Biden trying to govern following what has become of our institutions and the
Well,
kind of polarization we're in?
you're asking all the great questions. I think that one, again, go back to the crisis our country had with Watergate plus the Vietnam War. And Gerald Ford was asked, in many ways, Gerald Ford's personality is very much like Joe Biden. I've never really met anybody who personally dislikes Joe Biden or dislike Gerald Ford. They just nothing about them that's as their, and that's a personality trait that the Eisenhower had that. Some people have that. It doesn't mean you're flamboyant or a great speaker or even a great leader. It just means that you have a low dislike factor. And Gerald Ford wrote his memoir of his presidency, A Time to Heal. And Jimmy Carter wrote Keeping Faith. There was that period after the lies of the Vietnam War and Watergate, and it was a bipartisan mess. Nixon lied and Lyndon Johnson lied. Robert McNamara lied and Kissinger lied. You go back and forth and blame people, but there was this sense that we need a timeout and we have to kind of pull together. Biden, the famous 47 years of public service, has prided himself as a leader in bipartisanship. If I had to pick a word about his public career, it's he's always trying to be friends with the opposition. This is one reason why some people on the left, progressives, some of the Bernie Sanders people are suspicious of Biden because he's always willing to do deals across the aisle. So we'll see. I mean, I think he has a chance to probably do a few key things with the Republicans in 2021. I don't know who likes crumbling highways and infrastructure that's in danger. I'm not sure really, why shouldn't we be able to have our stockpiles for a future pandemic be prepared a little better than perhaps we were this time around when we couldn't find surgical gowns and hospital beds and the like. They may be able to do a few things in a bipartisan way out of the gate, but it's going to get brutal by the summer. And everybody, one of the great dilemmas of our time is I'm afraid I'm part of the problem in the sense I've already evoked 2024. We're not even done with 2020. We seem to be in a continual cycle. And the slogan that history will remember out of Biden campaign is to reclaim the soul of America. And on the Trump side, they feel it's to reclaim pioneer heritage America. And it's the good news is the young generation sees through all of this. It's the Generation Z or whatever you want to call it. Kids, young people in college today are grown up in a much more multicultural, integrated world. And I think that this may be what we're watching is a last gasp of something that occurred in Trump's America. Remember, he's a one-termer, Trump, and since 1789, when the institution of the presidency was created, there have been 10 one-term presidents. But since Franklin D. Roosevelt was president, meaning any semblance of modern times, the only times that a sitting president lost, Gerald Ford lost against Jimmy Carter in 1976, Jimmy Carter lost against Ronald Reagan in 1980, and George Herbert Walker Bush lost against Bill Clinton. So there's usually a great chance for an incumbent to get reelected. The fact that Donald Trump couldn't sell the bill, that you had so many Republicans defecting his agenda, that history will, Trump had a lot at stake, and that's why he's fighting right now. To being a one-term president, he'll be remembered that he was impeached, divided the country, used racist and xenophobic language, and yes, got these Supreme Court justices in. And there are other things, positive, negatives that'll come out, but it's going to be a very low-ranked presidency, the one-term Trump. If he had been reelected, it would have been that Trump owns the new Republican Party. It's Trump revolution. He would have been like a right-wing revolutionary figure. That has dissipated as of November 3rd. That revolution has run out of gas in its tank, or is near empty. And Trumpism will be alive and well. It's just like the Dixiecrats were, meaning Strom Thurmond, George Wallace types. McCarthyism and then John Birch streak is still out there across the land. It's not disappearing because Trump lost, but I think that they've lost an awful lot of their high octane fuel on this election. It was a poor performance by President Trump. He himself said Joe Biden is the worst candidate to ever run for president. What does that say when you lose to the worst candidate to ever be as president? So he'll become more and more of an aberration, Donald Trump, than perhaps the governing ethos of our land.
Then what does it say that the Democrats fell so short in the House and Senate races? Right?
Yeah, that's the very good.
Talk about that, and sort of historically when that happens, when the top of the ticket and the rest of the way down.
Two ways of looking at it. If you're a Democrat, I think it means there is a Republican Party in exile from Donald Trump alive. It was the Lincoln Project. It was a lot of Wall Street financiers. Investors right now aren't that uncomfortable with the situation of Biden as president and a Republican Senate to keep him in check on social programs with a less strong Pelosi. So I think history will show a lot of these Republicans that spoke out against Donald Trump, they're going to try to recreate a new Republican Party. They may go back to the Republican Party and try to get, I'm not quite saying Mitt Romney may be the person because he's yesterday's news in a way, but Marco Rubio or Nikki Haley may have to tact to a more middling position in order to win. Problem is, Trump, in losing, still controls a third of that Republican Party. So I don't know how you get the Republican nomination without Donald Trump's forces. But demographically, this is not good for the Republican Party. I mean, North Carolina, an inch away from being blue, Georgia turning blue, Texas might be 8 years away from being blue, and a growing Latino population. And they have some places that they've improved, like the Republicans in Florida, where they've done much better with Venezuelans, Cuban Americans, Colombian Americans, and the like. So that was good news for the Republicans. But I don't see how you can live off of Trumpism and what it stands for into a decade from now. It's just it'll take a different manifestation, but I think its potency was with Trump's showmanship, and that's been derailed.
I have lots of questions I'd like to keep asking you, but I see how many are coming in our chat. So I'm going to be respectful of that and begin bringing a few audience questions to you. And for everybody who's with us tonight, be a little patient. We'll try to get to all the themes that are here in the chat with us, even if we don't get entirely to your question. But there are a number of questions, Doug, that touch again on the Supreme Court, but particularly the proposal of packing the court. And I'll paraphrase and put a few of them together. What the long-term implications may be for the recent appointments to the court in terms of not the appointments per se, but the way in which they were appointed, and what the response to that might be, and where that might take us.
Important question. One certainly that's going to be talked about in early, January, for sure. I think Joe Biden will stay away from court packing. Almost certainly he will. He'll have fresh on anybody who studies history's memory when Franklin D. Roosevelt, hero of mine, made the mistake of trying to do it. The FDR won a landslide in 1936. I mean, he just killed it, and full of hubris said, you know what, one of the problems in America is there are 9 Supreme Court justices. There's nothing in the Constitution that says there can't be more. And a lot of these old-time conservatives aren't up to the tenor of modern times, and they're killing some of my New Deal programs. Some slipped through, but some got challenged in the Supreme Court. So he tried to go from 9 Supreme Court justices to 15. And that's where that term court packing came in. FDR didn't think about doing it like Biden or an AOC or Bernie Sanders, somebody might. He actually went for it. And he ended up getting sabotaged by Democrats in his own party. It wasn't just that the Republicans that were opposed to him, but a lot of Southern Democrats, more conservative Democrats, said that's a bridge way, way, way too far. You're starting to disassemble our judicial branch. And so to do that is you got to be like so full of hubris for Biden to try that. What he's doing now is trying to placate the left of his own party, progressives that would like that, out of anger at the way they rushed Amy Coney Barrett through, anger that on the line could be the Affordable Care Act, Roe v. Wade, civil rights legislation. And progressives would like to see Biden do it, meaning the left of his party. But the left of the Democratic Party didn't do all that well in this election. Do you realize that, kind of to your question earlier, Republicans, incumbents in Congress did not lose. This wasn't a wave year for progressivism. It was more in the end about get Trump out, that Trump's doing too much damage with his big mouth, his tweets, his ties to Russia, his authoritarianism. And it wasn't what I would consider a progressive wave moment. And Biden's going to have his hands full just trying to reassemble the heirlooms of Obamaism, as I mentioned before, meaning don't touch, thrill the Arctic, reinstate biologists in the Environmental Protection Agency, defend the Affordable Care Act. I mean, he's going to have his plate full. So I don't think he'll make that leap.
So, and there are a few questions that are coming in the chat that are related that says, okay, if not packing the court, would there ever be a move toward term limits on the Supreme Court, or would that be term limits of some sort?
I think that has more plausibility. I think the idea of shopping term limits could get a little bit of wind in its sail. But I'm even doubtful of that because, we're talking about a dysfunctional Washington, and the idea that grand, big new things are coming our way. I don't want to be delusional about that, but I would think that is the answer. Personally, I'm being personal here. I think that if there's a way to create term limits. The idea of hanging on till you're 95 and all, it's just old fashioned and another aspect of our democracy that needs reform. But whether this is the moment, I know everything seems like now, but the wheels of bureaucracy run quite slowly. I never forget that Lyndon Johnson did all his bold things, on the Great Society, NPR and PBS and Medicaid and Medicare and wild and scenic rivers and national hiking trails and Head Start and all this. He had 67 Democratic senators. Biden might have 49, meaning that only, not 67. And so those senatorial elections and congressional really matter. In order to do the big game changes on climate and Supreme Court reform that progressives would like, you're going to have to find ways to get more Democrat progressives in the US Senate.
And watching that and the timing on that, as you talk about getting progressives in the Senate, brings me back to thinking again about Georgia and what you think has helped move Georgia in that way. There's one narrative that says Stacey Abrams really, post Stacey Abrams, getting out the vote. So it is part of a different get out the vote, partly progressive, partly sitting somewhere else in the Biden coalition. So it will just be interesting to watch for all of us as that unfolds. There are a number of questions for you about that are related to the polls in the media, and you as a CNN presidential historian and commentator, but the polls in the media got it wrong again. So what does that tell us?
Tells you why it's good to be a historian, because we don't have to do the crystal ball reading that people want too much. But I think the polls are just not working, obviously. Michael Moore, the documentary filmmaker, said about Michigan, which is his home state, take whatever the polls are, like Biden's up by 10, and cut it in half. The Biden's in only, and then cut it in half again, meaning early on, Michael Moore was saying from Michigan, Biden's only up by 1 or 2 points, as it's turned out to be. So these polling services, I always become in disrepute after these kinds of moments. But then another year goes by and people want to talk, and it's an industry polls. And so I never pay them very much credence. And Donald Trump is somebody who's addicted to the idea of creating his own polls, like hearing reinforcement. So it depends on what polls you're looking at and when. And but we all knew generally this was going to be a pretty close election. We all kind of sensed it was going to be neck and neck. And the surprises, I think you're right when you mentioned Stacey Abrams. She's a great winner out of all this. That shows you the power of taking on, not being afraid to speak out and organize. And she's going to go down in history because of what happened in Georgia as somebody that people will talk about, the way a Shirley Chisholm was for being African-American from New York running for president, or there'll be biography written about Stacey Abrams as a mattering in history. This is a colorful, just quick side note. I'll be very quick about it. I spent election day and the day before, November 2nd and 3rd, I was in Atlanta working CNN, and I would go over to the home of the great baseball player, Hank Aaron, who beat Babe Ruth's record. And Hank and Billy Aaron are living down there. And I was taping him. I did it as a ploy so I wouldn't think about the election too much. I wanted a diversion. And hearing about his stories of racism and people, the hate mail, thousands of letters calling him every name because he was so quietly beating Babe Ruth's home run record in 1974 when he had to have security details. The FBI had to go protect his daughter who was at college because of a kidnapping. He was a baseball player And Atlanta is still with us, large, not talked about much now, but it was fascinating for him what Stacey Abrams did for the African American community. That it's been building there with Andy Young, Martin Luther King's close associate, and Julian Bond, and Joseph Lowry of Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Dr. King himself is from Atlanta. So they mobilized, and it's taken a while, but this election showed the power of the Atlanta people and educated urban and suburban voters versus a rural America. What happened in greater Atlanta is going to continue happening in Houston's and San Antonio and Austin's as these urban centers grow and spread out more and more, which means rural America is lucky that they still have, South Dakota, 2 senators, what California only gets 2. So rural America still has some perks when it comes to the US Senate. But I think when it comes to national elections, they've got to come up, the Republicans, with a strategy that penetrates urban and suburban areas. Trump failed in that regard.
And as we were talking, we started off there on polls. One of our students, Ry Cullen, pointed out in 2018, the pollsters were much more accurate. So it's interesting to be in the midterms versus presidential elections. One of the questions that made its way here was asking about the accomplishments, the gains of the Obama years, the degree to which those have been rolled back in the Trump years, and sort of where the Obama legacy sits at this moment, 4 years on and entering potentially a reconnection or an attempt to continue it. But how much has been rolled back?
Well, Barack Obama just did a great service for Joe Biden, the way he entered the campaign in the last weeks. Obama's rallies were quite phenomenal, whether in Detroit with Stevie Wonder or in Atlanta or in Florida. He really kind of went out there. And then President Obama has his memoir coming out in about a week or 10 days called A Promised Land. And Barack Obama really started out as a writer, a grassroots organizer, but he prides himself in being a literary person. And his memoir is going to make him ubiquitous coming up. Meaning here in another week, he will be on all these shows, all talking everywhere. You're going to be getting Obama. Michelle's Obama was this mega hit book, and Barack Obama's will break all sorts of records coming up. And it'll be seen as I suggested, if Trump had gotten a 1, Obama's legacy was going to take some shiners, because Trump would have worked very hard with this Supreme Court to dismantle the Affordable Care Act and the EPA regulation rollbacks and the like that Obama did. I think now Obama can basically work the Biden years as a 3rd term to solidify his signature achievements, meaning, and one of the things worth mentioning that Obama doesn't get credit for, we're talking about justice, and maybe it was a hotter topic earlier in the year with statues coming down of Confederates and what is real history, and should we go back to why are we starting our history at 1776 and not with the first wave of slaves coming to the New World? And the Obama, as presidency, people don't realize he saved Stonewall in New York City, LGBTQ as a national monument. Cesar Chavez, Latino leaders site, Buffalo Soldiers for African American sites, Bears Ear in Utah, a national monument run by the National Park Service, administered by 5 Native American tribes, Harriet Tubman sites. Obama, being who he is, was trying to open the narrative of American history up for inclusion and truthful history. And you saw the Trump trying to reduce it back to 100 years, where even Confederate leaders should still have forts named after them and have statues. I think that will all come back. I think Biden's, meaning some of these are in court, like Bears Ear in Utah. I think that'll end up being saved because of the environmental groups in that case, environmental defense Fund and groups like this, these lawsuits, Sierra Club and the like, have stalled a lot of Trump's environmental measures. They've tied it up in legal red tape, Endangered Species Act, Clean Air and Water Acts. So on the environment, I think it'll be a very progressive administration, the Biden administration. They're going to try to reinstate whatever Obama did and then take it a step further.
And there's
But the Obamas also, I think that Obama will be able to come and speak in a week all over about what we talked about earlier in this discussion about conspiracy history. Who would have ever thought we'd have an America where people would talk about our naval SEALs did not kill Osama bin Laden, that it's all a fabrication, the birtherism of and all. I mean, the story of birtherism and Barack Obama's going to live for hundreds of years. It's a symbol of hatred, birtherism. And Obama is going to have the #1 book in the country, and his VP is president, and all of his big acts reinvigorated, while Trump will be retired.
And one of the questions that came through that's related to that, much of Obama's work ended up being through executive orders, right? And will Biden have to, do you think, continue in that way of working, given that he's unlikely to have a fully cooperative Senate?
Boy, what a good question. And that's what I said. Look, thing about executive power in the presidents, if it's your president, you love it. Because I'm an environmental conservator, that's why I worked with, in Bronxville with, Historical Conservancy. I just love preservation and things with the environment. So when Theodore Roosevelt was president and he went to the Grand Canyon and said, do not touch it, God has made it, leave it alone. And the Senate wanted to mine it for zinc, asbestos, and copper. And TR uses an executive order to save all of the Grand Canyon. We're cheering, I'm cheering. But if Trump does the same to say Bears Ear 5, we're going to open it up for mining and thing, I'm like, no, so if it becomes the problem with that, a kind of executive power is, people cheer it when it's on their team. And when it's the other team, they loathe it. So it is better to create a congressional situation. And we don't have time tonight for it, but Congress is quite dysfunctional, right? Washington is dysfunctional, and it's been under Obama and Trump, you've seen presidents resorting to executive power perhaps too much, and not finding a way to do things. When it's done through Congress, it's more permanent. But we'll have to see. I said one of the advantages of a historian is I watched my predictions, but I would think Biden is going to try to build a legislative record out of the gate, but we'll see if he gets flummoxed with that, and he might end up resorting to executive power.
And it's just hit the chat, and it was on my list too. Let's talk about Kamala Harris. I can't believe I've waited an hour into this conversation to do it, but Kamala Harris on this ticket. Just give us some perspective as a presidential historian on this vice presidential pick.
I'm so glad you asked about her. And I'm embarrassed I haven't mentioned her yet, because I've been bugging CNN to talk about her a little more. I think that will come after we get out of this period here. Astounding, isn't it? I mean, in 1920 was the year women got the right to vote. It was this year was the 100 years of women's suffragist movement, even though African-American women weren't given those equal rights, but never, it's still the Seneca Falls movement of New York that led to, eventually the suffragist movement in 1920, women getting the right to vote. Finally, America has its first woman vice president. And you always thought if that ever happened, it would be just the national news. And here we are barely remembering to talk about it. Things are so hurried, pretty historic. I mean, we're going to be watching an inauguration, not just of Joe Biden, but of Kamala Harris and another, milestone in US history. And she did a very good job for Joe Biden. You know, she did not make a single mistake once he picked her. She was a pro. It's all of us would make mistakes. You say one thing wrong and you get misinterpreted and you're talking all day, and Lord knows Biden makes mistakes constantly. She didn't make any. She is a really incredible legal mind, a prosecutorial bent, brilliant, and now, like Stacey Abrams, and even more so, is going to be one of these larger than life figures in American history. And due to the age of Joe Biden, her importance increases. I mean, she very well might be running for president in 4 years or 8 years. And she's a major player in America now. And you can see Bill and Hillary Clinton kind of sinking in history in their kinetic appeal. Obama in his own unique way, maybe the Obamas are still the leaders of the Democratic Party in some way. They are so popular.
Quite something at this moment as we do that. And in talking about, you mentioned Joe Biden's age. So we had the two oldest candidates running for president ever, one against the other. What does that say about presidential politics?
Boy, I know, and it felt kind of disappointing to watch it, because there's always the dream of a new generation, you know, John F. Kennedy taking the torch of a new generation of leadership. And now we were with two white men in their mid to late 70s. With that said, Trump won in the Republican world as this sort of outsider, and you know, smashed Republicans when he first ran as the business person. And Biden had the imprint of Barack Obama on him. The fact that Obama called him a brother, the fact that he was the vice president for Obama, it made a lot of the African American community comfortable with Biden, particularly Claiborne in South Carolina, who turned the game for Biden. But I see Biden right now as kind of a placeholder. And it's why I mentioned Gerald Ford. This may just be a time that he can get control of and heal our institutions that have been really beat up on. I mean, the State Department, or to FBI, to EPA, to Interior. It's been a war on the so-called deep state, and this trying to humiliate and demean people that work for us. That most people that are in government aren't showy. They're doing their jobs day to day to make our country work. And when you're watching these people, you can't help but be touched at all these polling stations across America, everyday citizens volunteering to count ballots. And so all of that to me is very positive, but I'm hoping down the line here, we start getting candidates running for president to reflect a little bit of a younger demographic, because we all are, at my age now, I feel like we have to count on the young generation to step forward, and we need to give them a chance. I thought Beto O'Rourke may have been able to pull it off for the Democrats, or Kamala Harris, or Cory Booker, but alas, Biden had enough of a Rolodex and enough perhaps, and obviously winning is easy to be right. I mean, that feeling that somehow it wasn't time for the Democratic Party to lose Ohio and Western Pennsylvania. And Biden has made a career of being the third senator from Pennsylvania. Amtrak Joe, Lunch Bucket Joe, knew how to talk to that generation. And so they may have picked the right person for the time, but I'm hoping not every 4 years we're having two people, approaching 80 years old as the nominees, because I'm going to be 60 years old this December, and I'm aching. And, I mean, it's just a lot of work, these campaigns. I felt terrible for at times for Biden and Trump, that how much do they have to just pound the pavement nonstop. And in that way, COVID incidentally will always be part of 2020. It gave Biden a chance to run his Delaware campaign, which was what William McKinley did in 1896. McKinley won the presidency and never went to tour the country. He sat in Canton, Ohio at his house. Now, Biden didn't do that. He got out and around, but the idea was you don't always have to go do these kind of try to be Mr. Rally, and particularly doing rallies during a pandemic when our scientific experts are pleading us not to do such a thing. It was reckless of Donald Trump, and he's paid a price for it, because a lot of the Republicans the Republicans that did abandon Trump, most of them, if you talk to, will say Trump's anti-science. I can't handle that. I mean, that he just denies pure scientific evidence, and may have been what that conspiratorial bent of Trump is what's been most worrisome to me, that in his language of prejudice and bigotry.
And there are a number of questions, speaking of Trump's language and bigotry, a number of questions that have come through in the chat about immigrants, immigration policy, dreamers, role that immigrants played in this election. So it's a huge topic I just threw out because there were a lot of different questions, but maybe you could take some aspects of that, particularly, again, at this moment where we are watching that kind of movement, and those of us who are at colleges and universities particularly think about the dreamers who are key parts of our community. Your thoughts on whether and how Biden administration could actually move immigration policy, and this relates to another question, and Biden's own history with immigration policy in the Obama administration.
I'm smiling when you ask that question, because I feel like the dreamers, as they're called in America, are cheering wildly about the election of Biden. It's has to be a relief. You're now going to have the executive branch and Congress working in unity to try to allow dreamers to be American citizens. There are going to probably need some Republicans that will to get a final compromise on exact language, but I feel that that's something that Biden will be able to accomplish, something that desperately needs to be done right now. The Trump and immigration is such a messy topic, and you're right, it's so large, but this symbol of the wall with Mexico and these concrete slabs that'll be there, and you wonder what people are going to think of the physical structure of this wall. I went down there with Rory Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy's daughter, who is the great HBO documentarian. I gave her the idea long before Donald Trump to go down and see the piece of wall that was there. You can just go in and out, and it's a engineering boondoggle, the whole physical wall on the border. And I imagine years from now we'll go down there and look at ruins of it in a way that's it's just, with modern technology, with drones, with ways to monitor the border and all, the whole concept of this moat, of the way it was conceived by Donald Trump. I'm a builder and I'll put it up and all of this. It's just going to be a symbol of xenophobia and anti-immigration rhetoric. I think that if you want to mess with the Republican Party, wants to stay a demonizing recent immigrants, good luck on winning national elections. I don't find it demographically to be a winning issue when more and more of Americans are from other countries besides Western Europe. And I've been sad. I won't go anymore so we could take some more questions.
I'll take you one little bit on the last of that, though, and there's a question related to it, because there was significant support for Donald Trump among some of the first-gen immigrant communities, right? The next but one. And so even as you say, it's not a winning issue for Republicans. There was a part or a way that they cut that. But a number of questions that we have are a version of what can happen over the next 2 months, and I'm putting them broadly into that. What sorts of things might the president, through executive order or other, in terms of firing people or in terms of changing, what sort of things could happen in the next 2 months? What happens, and when in history have we had the likelihood of a transition that was at the very least not likely to be a cooperative one, president to president? Different thing about the Washington state. I have a daughter who's in the Foreign Service, so I'm I know the civil service people a little bit, but how, talk about this transition.
Well, where's your daughter at?
She's in Jamaica now. She's in the embassy in Jamaica.
Oh, okay. Well, I love the idea of young people going into the Foreign Service. I did my graduate work at Georgetown, studying diplomacy, and it interested me tremendously, the whole Foreign Service world. You know, I on the immigration issue. Well, I mean, look, it's going to be a chaotic couple months. What can I tell you? I don't know. I get worried. I hate to even say this because it sounds like I'm just a voice that doesn't like President Trump. I'm very concerned about his mental capacity to lead right now. Burning weird hours, and meaning that press conference hastily called of where he was saying inane things, and this, for somebody of that psychological makeup, if he is that sort of a narcissistic personality, he's going to be an insomniac. Or and then he recently had the COVID, and you combine it all with his temper and leaks out of the White House that we're in a little bit of a dangerous period with what President Trump might do, I'm afraid to say. But there'll hopefully be people around to keep an eye on that part of it. I don't even know if they'll show up for the inauguration of Biden. He may say, I refuse to be there. I know I'm going to not recognize this outcome, even if whatever may happen. This clamor, I don't know whether it equals violence in America or not. Nobody wants to predict such a thing. I don't know where one would particularly target, but every day I'm a little worried as this goes on, that somebody's going to do something, or a group of people will do something heinous, and might have a trigger powder keg effect. But we just have to hope that that's not the case, and remind ourselves that our country, pat ourselves on the back, our country just held a free and fair election. Votes are counted. Everybody's votes counted. There is no corruption in this election. And that's politics. You win and you lose. It's a game. Anybody at Sir Lawrence playing a sport, you win or you lose. And it's what we're dealing with is, like Herman Melville, the writer of Moby Dick, but he wrote the famous short story Bartleby the Scrivener, which I recommend everybody read at Sir Lawrence. And what a short little piece by Melville. But in Bartleby the Scrivener, the character gets dismissed from his employment and refuses to accept this dismissal, and says, you got to leave. And Bartleby says, I prefer not to, and just sits there. I mean, I'm really worried. How do we get President Trump out of the White House? We may be dealing with somebody who's has sociopathic tendencies here. I don't say that lightly. Didn't go into doing U.S. history and studying presidents and teaching classes to bemoan and deride presidents. And I'm always willing to do a revisionist look at them, like the way Ronald Reagan worked with Gorbachev to help rid nuclear weapons during the Cold War. It was unlikely. Or the way Lyndon Johnson should be criticized for the mistaken war in Vietnam, but yet he did so many great things with the war on poverty, but particularly Medicaid and Medicare. So we can look at records and all, but the behavior of Donald Trump right now is damaging our democracy abroad, and he's damaging our national security. by him just not taking the temperature down. He's trying to ratchet it up. And I find that unforgivable.
I have a question that just came in that sort of follows that connects to the fact that you did a wonderful book about Walter Cronkite, and who was someone who was this voice of America in a way, right? Of guiding America at times in tumultuous times. So what kind of journalistic voice is that today, or where or how do we find that voice in our current era? Is there such a thing as that voice in our current era?
Oh, well, look, there's some great journalists out there. Maggie Haberman of Sarah Lawrence graduate, one of the great journalists of our time. My friend Peter Baker for the New York Times, just fantastic. I can go on, I can name 50 of some of our really great journalists. With that said, the question's really important. For when Cronkite left the evening news, when he was playing a role of referee and mediator, we had, he had a, like, journalist had like something close to a 70% approval rating. By the time now, journalists are at like 20% or something. I mean, from near 70 to 20 is quite a drop. It used to be, if you told people in America you were a reporter, everybody said, oh my God, you know, you were like treated like a doctor or a teacher. And now many people look at journalists with suspicion. Trump spread a lot of that with fake news and calling the press the enemy of the people. And to be fair, the blurring of news and entertainment has had some has had consequences too. So I don't. That's another one of these big problems. I think it could sort itself out if you know. If what I never finished the story, but Cronkite wanted middle schools and high schools to have classes on how to read what's true in journalism and what's not. Meaning, you know, busy parents are just sending their kids, here's your mechanism, go at it. And what if we had a way that was mandatory in school systems to learn how to find what are real news sites, what are factual information, train people on where to get the resources that are accurate and helpful, or at least give them a starter course, instead of just blowing this whole thing up and letting people go down all sorts of dark avenues at a very early age. But I get heartened that we've had great journalists. I mean, look at when any time president, look how hard the reporters studied Donald Trump, stayed at it, looked at nefarious behavior, you know, and you know, the same with, it happened, it just happens, Obama had one of the cleanest administrations, meaning lack of indictments of those years, but hopefully the press will start looking in the Biden administration and try to weed out corruption. We need the press badly. And I feel that I think we do have as great of reporters as we've ever had in America right now. They're just amazing, but we also have this, a lot of bad news sites and perhaps too much of a quick jump, wanting to be first, calling things, maybe not triple sourcing. Maybe we got to go back in teaching journalism to keep people realizing don't take a rumor and call it news. Again, I don't like to eat up my clock with people with questions with too much storytelling, but you know, when Jimmy Carter lost the presidency in 1980, he really felt what he had left was his integrity. He got killed by Ronald Reagan, but nobody ever thought of Jimmy Carter as not having some kind of bedrock integrity. And lo and behold, the Washington Post ran a story reporting a rumor that Jimmy Carter had bugged Blair House, the guest house near the White House, when the Reagans were staying there. Well, the defense of the Washington Post in this case, it was called the Ear. It was like a column that was in the Washington Post. There was that we didn't say Carter bugged Blair House. We said there's a rumor in Washington that he is. And old Jimmy Carter sued him. And he got the lawsuit held in Sumter County, Georgia, where he lived, and said, this damaged my reputation. You're saying, who could trust somebody that's illegally bugging somebody? And the Post kept saying it's a rumor, and Carter won that case. So I think people are going to have to sue when they're, unfortunately, we're so legalistic, sue when we have false news reporting that's done, that does deep damage into people's reputations.
There's so many things we could talk about. We're coming up on our time. I want to respect your time. I know you're being called by CNN at all hours of the night. But just a moment again, the umbrella of this series that we're talking about is justice. So we're at a moment of a presidential transition in the midst of a global pandemic, a long, long, long overdue racial reckoning in our country, a climate crisis, and an economic crisis. As a historian, watching other presidencies, what advice would you give to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as they enter a presidency with that front and center, a global pandemic that is affecting communities of Black and brown communities far more greatly, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, my big passion, I guess, because the election just happened and we're talking, I'm wearing my presidential historian hat, but I'm writing right now a book called Silent Spring Revolution about Rachel Carson in the 1960s and 70s environmental movement. And it's amazing. I just wondered how they did it. How did a generation ban DDT? How did they get a Clean Air and Water Act to reduce emissions? How did they get lead out of gasoline? How did they make the Great Lakes from being near dead, or at least Lake Erie? How did they bring it back to life? How did we create an environmental protection agency? How did we do marine mammal protection acts? How did we start banning oil drilling off of parts of California and Florida? And I mean, so a lot happened, and I realized it's a movement. And I'm very interested on the justice theme of environmental justice. The amount of toxic waste that are put into poor neighborhoods in this country that that affect people of color in a disproportionate manner is staggering. And I'm studying in the 1960s when there would be these toxic dump sites just put right in the middle of an African-American community in Houston, Texas, or how the Navajo reservation with uranium work conditions, Native Americans working and getting ill. And I'm writing about the coal mining in West Virginia when a whole towns in the Buffalo Creek disaster in 1972 got wiped out. And you have to create a movement. And I think the climate change movement is upon us. We're here, we want to do something about it. And it's just going to take intense grassroots organizing, as you're seeing, I think, most effectively being done by progressives. But this planet is in sad, sad shape right now. And the idea that we're purposely putting poisonous materials into cancer alleys in Louisiana, or putting garbage dump sites in Bronx that could be somewhere else, or in incinerators that affect the air. To me, I had to choose that as my justice issue, environmental justice, because I started getting a little overwhelmed with it all. And climate change alone is overwhelming. And I thought I can spend the rest of my life focusing on, the environmental, or that isn't just saving Yosemite in Yellowstone, although God knows that's great work that we did in our country. We save all these places, state parks and forests and all, but now we got to maintain them, and we're going to have to do a lot to protect our planet, because the story, as we all know, is deeply grim. And I'm hoping that in my lifetime, we start getting off of fossil fuels, and that we find ways to create a green type of sustainable lifestyle in America. So I'm going to use my skills as a historian to shed light on these places of environmental justice, the Flint water crises that have happened, that have been forgotten in American history as surely as a lot of other types of history, like Donora, Pennsylvania in 1948, when the entire community got sick because factory smog trapped an entire city with people dying like flies and everybody being rushed to respiratory wards from sickness. And I get a little hopeful too, because like in Los Angeles, the smog was much worse than it was up until the wildfires. Now you're getting smog with wildfires in California, and people are having a hard time breathing out of there. And if these forest fires are the new normal and increase cyclonic activity, there might be a hurricane hitting Miami soon. We're in trouble. And it's going to disproportionately affect people that don't have the money to move from a particular area, don't have the, and in countries of drought in the world, the poor of the world are going to get hammered in the age of climate that is upon us now. So that is a big justice issue.
Yeah. Well, we'll all look forward to that next book of yours. One quick question from our audience. Do you think they're going to call Pennsylvania tonight?
I would doubt it. I think what Biden would want to make sure is that I think Biden is going to infer that he's won Pennsylvania, but he's willing to, there may be a recount, or he'll simply say, well, wait, we're going to count every damn ballot. One thing you don't want to do now is some of our servicemen and women and people in foreign service, their votes haven't been counted. And you don't want to act like you're right now. I mean, it's so sensitive out there, but I think what one's going to get out of tonight is that, and this weekend, is that Biden is the incoming president, and that everything that Trump does is just an act of utter and sheer desperation. And this election's over. And I think that's going to become clear. Every batch of votes coming out of Pennsylvania, every minute it's going to be clear. The idea that Trump can now turn and flip Georgia, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada is gone. It's just not a scenario that can happen. So Biden is the president. Now it's a matter of timing, where he doesn't want to be showy, but you don't want to not come out and say, hey, everybody, show some enthusiasm and have some horns beep. The beeping rallies are a signal of his respect, Biden, for COVID. The mask rally will be known in history, that while Trump went to Tulsa and filled up an arena, and Herman Cain and others died of COVID, most likely contracted there, but possibly not. But the Biden symbol will be of the social distance, mask wearing variety, but he's going to be showing he's happy. That Kamala Harris and Joe Biden are in a jubilant mood right now. They're just having to repress it a little bit due to the vote counting going on, but they are feeling the weight of the world off their shoulders.
Well, the weight of the world off their shoulders is the weight of the world comes fully on their shoulders in the work that they will be about to undertake. I want to thank you so much for being with us tonight, Doug. We could keep this going for a long time, but we thank you all so much for being with us tonight. And Doug, thank you so much for this conversation and for sharing your time, your expertise, your wisdom with us. Delighted to have you.
You did an incredible job of interviewing. Your knowledge of history and the news world and what's going on is phenomenal. I enjoyed it, and to be continued, everybody. You have a great weekend.
Thanks so much.
All right.
Good night, everybody.
Night.